Okay, let's get started with what we're doing today. So, when we left off, we have been talking about heredity, and we're talking about twin studies because that's one of the ways to try to test how much genetics influence certain traits, the variability of those traits in a population. And so we're about a minute into it. It's a radio story about a certain twin study and a certain group of twins that were separated at birth.
When I look at caller ID and it said Louise Wise Services, and I had always known the name of the agency where I was adopted. And, my heart kind of started to beat quickly, and I thought, why would they be calling me after all these years? And the woman on the other end of the line confirmed that I was, in fact, Paula Bernstein, and I was adopted from Louise Wise. And then she said, well, I've got some news for you. I thought I should tell you in case you were walking down Fifth Avenue and ran into someone who looks exactly like you do. And then she said, you've got a twin who's looking for you. And she at that point said, I hope I did the right thing in telling you. Are you prepared to hear your twin's name? And I said, yes. And she told me her name, and I thought, I have a twin, and her name is Elise Shine. My name is Elise Shine. I was living in Paris, and Paula was in New York. So, I head off to New York, and we arranged to meet at a nearby cafe in the East Village. I was very nervous about what I was wearing. How do you dress to meet your identical... Oops, sorry. Well, I was sitting on the terrace. It was a gorgeous spring day, and I was wearing sunglasses and, nervously chain smoking. And then, suddenly she saw me. I came over and said, Elise? And she got up, and we kind of gingerly patted each other, which was funny. There was no tearful hug. And then we began to inspect each other. It was like, monkeys in a zoo, that we were kind of inspecting each other's bodies. And I remember I said, do you have chubby knees? And I kind of glanced down below the hem of her skirt and saw that her knees were quite cute. And I always thought of mine as kind of chubby. So I thought, well, why did she get the cute knees? It was just a natural instinct for us to start comparing. We had 35 years to catch up on. How do you start asking somebody, what have you been up to since we shared a room together? Where do you start? Very soon after Elise and I reunited, I said, do you know why we were separated? And she said, well, the woman at the agency said we were separated for a study on nature versus nurture. The only study of its kind on separated twins from infancy. When the families adopted these children, they were told that their child was already part of an ongoing child study, but of course they neglected to tell them the key element of the study, which is that it was child development among twins raised in different homes.
My name's Lawrence Perlman, and in 1968-69 I was a research assistant on Dr. Peter Neubauer's study of twins reared apart. Apparently, Viola Bernard, who was a very prominent child psychiatrist and a consultant to Louise Wise Services, the adoption agency, had a really strong belief that twins should be raised separately. This idea that twins are often dressed the same and kind of treated exactly the same, she felt interfered with their independent psychological development. So she had mentioned this to Peter Neubauer, who was a very prominent child psychiatrist, and he said, oh, there's a great opportunity to do a research study, and that's how the study was born. And Paula and Elise were newborns, so I had seen them in their foster care So at that time they were called Marion and Jean, which I guess were the names that their mother had given them. And these are some notes of the visit that I did when Paula and Elise were 28 days old. Jean tends to be more active than Marion, wakes sooner, cries more lustily and persistently, and is less easily diverted. They seem advanced for their age.
They eat heartily and already take solid foods, sleep soundly, and can even be moved about and taken outside without disturbing their sleep. It's hard to look at this and realize that I was this foster child who, for the first 5 months of my life, really lived with my twin sister.
Since the beginning of science, twins have offered a unique opportunity to study to what extent nature versus nurture influences the way we develop, the people that we turn out to be. My name is Lawrence Wright, and a few years ago I wrote a book about twin studies. It was called Twins. Every other twin study that I'm aware of, especially of identical twins who have been separated at birth, is retrospective. Usually the twins are discovered, oftentimes in the middle of their lives. The Neubauer study differs from all other twin studies in that it looked at the twins at the beginning of their lives. They were filmed as they were struggling to their feet the first time. They were filmed as they went out on a bicycle for the first time. Their intelligence was assessed, their personality. All of these things were measured. And no one, neither the twins nor their adoptive parents, realized that they were adopting identical twins, separated from each other. From a scientific point of view, it's beautiful. It's practically the perfect study. But this study would never happen today.
So the study ended in 1980, and then a year later, New York State began requiring adoption agencies to keep siblings together.
At that point, they realized public opinion would be so against them that they wouldn't dare publish the study. It's kind of disturbing to think that all this material about us is, in some file cabinet somewhere, and really for ourselves, we had to figure out what the true story was.
So then we immediately attempted to reach Dr. Neubauer and called him, and he refused to speak with us initially.
As time passed, he realized that we were persistent enough that we were not going away, and he did grant us kind of an unofficial interview at his house. I think what we wanted was for him to say, at the time, we genuinely thought this was the best thing to do. I'm sorry if we seem to have not anticipated what might happen in separating the twins. And while he showed no ounce of remorse and certainly offered no apology, I think we really had created in our mind this idea that we were meeting Dr. Frankenstein. And in fact, he was rather charming. I almost felt like he was this doting uncle. And by the end, he said, well, you'll have to come back next time for some Viennese pastries.
Dr. Peter Neubauer is not only a very distinguished psychiatrist, he's also on the board of the Freud Archives. He's internationally renowned in his field. And yet I think very few people who know Dr. Neubauer are aware of his study. He's rarely spoken to anyone about those studies.
The study was only based on a small number of identical twins.
I interviewed Dr. Neubauer and I recorded those conversations.
How many twins are aware that they're twins and how many are not?
For many, many reasons. I don't want to talk about that.
Still, I'm wondering, let me try to put it in more concrete terms. If you were to take one twin out of family A and change places with his co-twin in family B, would he be essentially the same person?
Well, that's exactly the point, huh?
Yeah.
I tell you what we have found in each of the areas.
Okay, go ahead.
A very, very high degree of concordance in all areas. If you can support a human being fully, then they can become who they really are. And if we interfere with it, naturally, we'll never know who they really could have been.
This does seem like it's such a significant study.
Yes.
Have there been ethical questions raised about this study?
Yeah, there were questions raised by a number of people.
He was apologetic about the study. He insisted that at the time it was a matter of scientific consensus that twins were better off being separated at birth and raised separately. I never found anything in the literature to support that.
Look, I have to run to another meeting.
Okay, thanks again for your time.
Bye-bye.
You know, no such study will ever be done again, nor should it be. But it would be very interesting to learn what this study has to teach us.
It's kind of jarring and thrilling to see a carbon copy of the same person. Partially because twins really do force us to question what is it that makes each of us who we are. Since meeting Elise, it's undeniable that genetics play a huge role. You know, it's not just our taste in music or books. You know, it goes beyond that. In her, I see the same basic personality. Certainly, we've made very different life choices. I mean, she's married and has children, and I've been traveling a lot, and, you know, I'm still single. You know, it's not as if one of us led the true life, you know, the true outcome of this particular DNA combination. You know, if I were raised by Paula's parents and she were raised by my parents, would I be her? Would she be me? And I think the answer we've decided is no. Elise, when we first met, would talk often about if we had grown up together, and she was frustrated by my inability to imagine a shared life. Would have been like, part of me, I think, felt protective of my old life. You know, as much as I think they did the wrong thing, they should not have separated us. We should have grown up together. And yet, I can't go back and imagine my life growing up with Elise. That life never happened. And it is sad that as close as we are now, there's no way we can ever compensate for those 35 years.
Me and Paula, it's hard to see where we're going to go. It's really uncharted territory. But I really love her, and I can't imagine my life without her.
Dr. Peter Neubauer declined to be interviewed for this story. Of the 13 children involved in his study, 3 sets of twins and 1 set of triplets have discovered their siblings. There are still 4 people who don't know that they have an identical twin. Our story was produced by Joe Richmond of Radio Diaries with help from Deborah George, Ben Shapiro, and Ana Yancy Diaz-Cortez. Paula Burns.
So these are pictures of those twins when they were kids and close to when they met. It says Paula's on the left here. Let me see. Yeah, they have Paula on the left in both pictures, and Elise on the right. They look more alike when they're kids. That's pretty typical.
One of them has a different hair, another one has a different hairstyle.
Yeah, they have different hair color. Yep. So, what do you think is striking about that story?
Oh, the twins do identical twins like that literally have every single bit of their DNA the same.
All their DNA is the same. They could have had mutations like in their cells as their cells were dividing. So what did you learn from that story? Yes? Yeah.
Some families they may want to adopt both the two children, but they separate them.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's pretty strange about this particular story. In this study, they purposely separated the twins. And then they wanted to see from the beginning what compared them. In most of the other twin studies, even separation of twin studies, it's just they happen to be separated. And then when they're later on, studies identify them as twins and compare them. Yes?
So it seems strange to me that they don't believe that they would be the same exact person if they were put in the same situation, considering they have the exact same DNA. If they had the exact same DNA, the way that the body should react to the situation, like as they grow up, like the only differences would be is as they're in a very small infant, if they were have to be treated differently, that would create different ways that their mind would be able to make versus how their biology would be.
Yeah, philosophically, one of the things that comes up, we always talk about nature versus nurture, but that kind of implies that there's no other influence. There's either your genetics or your environment. So what else do you think, why do they think that they would still be the same person if they were in a different environment? Well, why would their parents think that they were twins? The parents, yeah. They probably just thought, oh, they're in a study about being adopted. So it's there's also kind of the ethical question. The people who did the study say, well, it was some people thought that twins were better off being separated because that way they could be more individual and they wouldn't be always mistaken for each other or not treated as separate. But then there's other people who are saying, no, you just separated them for the study, for your own gain, not because you thought it was best. But now it's illegal to do that. So twins and siblings can't be separated, at least not in New York. So for part of it, they had a tape of an interview with the Dr. Neubauer, who was in charge of the study. And what did he say about nature versus nurture? What did he think was the effects of nature and nurture on people? Anyone catch that? He did have a little bit of an accent. He was saying it's genetics. He was kind of saying the genetics and the environment, the way that they work is that as long as the environment is up to a certain level, then the genetics will come through. So he's kind of saying the environment doesn't matter too much unless one of the environments is neglectful or they're malnourished or something and the other one isn't. That was his take on it. But he's not allowed to publish the results because of the ethical problems with the study. So we can't see the data, and no one's allowed to see it until it's after the people who did it have passed away. So they can't benefit from the study since they did unethical things. There was someone out there with a weed whacker. Jeez. Okay, so At least that was an easy problem to solve. So the nice thing about twin studies is that you have a little bit of a control because their DNA is very close to identical. And then you know that they have different environments because they weren't raised by the same people. But at least in this case with these twins, they were given to a Jewish adoption agency, and the people who adopted them were also Jewish. So they had that cultural aspect, but one of the families was more religious than the other. So it's kind of interesting. Sometimes there are similarities between adopted families. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about how to interpret twin studies. But
For lack of a least, got some more. Just one person reading. I don't know why.
that's interesting. I can't remember. It's hard for me to keep them straight in my mind, even though I actually read their book. So their book is on the list of books you can read for extra credit and do a book report. And it is a good book. It's easy, it's easy to follow. So they kind of take turns writing about their experience of meeting each other and all of that, finding out what happened. So, yeah, it's called Identical Strangers. But, so that's just one example of a type of twin study. Twins that are separated, then you compare how they turned out since they had different environments. Do you guys remember yesterday we talked about another type of twin study? What's another type of twin study that they use to look at heredity? Yeah, good. I compare identical twins and fraternal twins because identical twins share more genetic similarity than fraternal, but usually those ones aren't separated, so their environments are pretty similar. So that's the control there, and then you see if identical twins are more similar in one trait, that seems to point to genetics being involved. These are actually a picture from a news story about some other separated twins who they both turned out to be firefighters.
And they look the same.
Yeah. That's how they found each other, is someone knew both of them actually. And it was like, hey, you should meet this guy who looks exactly like you and is also a firefighter.
Oh, man.
So some of the things that those type of separated twin studies have found is that people who are separated, they still tend to have similar personalities, styles of thinking, and relating to other people. So if you measure their personality with personality tests, they tend to get, there's a correlation in their scores. They tend to get more similar scores. And these studies also show the correlation in their some of the other abilities, like IQ test scores. So even though they weren't raised together, they have that correlation. Compared to, they have a higher correlation than they would with just some random person that they're not genetically similar to. Some of their attitudes or perspectives have similarities. We'll talk about which ones seem to be more related to parenting, but there do seem to be some similarities in interests and tastes. For example, both of those twins, Elise and Paula, they both majored in film. And they were both really into like obscure films and that kind of thing. So they did have that similarity. And so there are some commonalities that seem to be higher in twins even though they were separated. There are also, it's interesting that there are some similarities in specific fears or phobias between separated twins. So it seems like there's a genetic or evolutionary influence on if you have, if you're prone to have a strong fear of spiders or snakes or talking in public or whatever. So there are similarities just in humans in general, but then even twins have greater similarity. There are even studies showing similarities in physiological measures like brainwave patterns and heart rate patterns. So, for example, some people have a really variable heart rate where it kind of goes up and down a lot, and then other people have a steady heart rate. And then if you look at like resting heart rate, those things correlate with identical twins. So you'll hopefully notice that some of these are similar to the results of the other type of twin study. Do you remember which of these things was also on when we talked about the identical versus fraternal?
It says personality, behaviors, and attitudes.
Yeah, personality, and then attitudes and intelligence test scores in particular have been tested and shown this genetic influence. So, that being said, there are some critiques of twin studies. So these are some of the issues with twin studies that makes them not as perfect as we would like. Some of the separated twins found each other before the data was collected on them. So they started to know each other already. So that could have influenced each other, right? So, for example, like those firemen twins, they knew each other for a certain amount of time before somebody did a study on them, on the separated twins. So that happens a lot. That's one of the reasons why they would have wanted to do that study that's unethical, where they separated the twins and didn't tell them they were twins or who the other twin was. Because if you know you have a twin, you might be influenced by their interests and things like that. Also, people don't take into account how often coincidences happen when they hear the stories, like anecdotal stories of twins who are separated. Some of the power of these twin stories is based on like articles and things we've seen where they talk about, oh my goodness, they both named their cat Jackie, and they both have a daughter named Dawn, and they both like, skating or whatever, So the problem with that is that if you talk to anybody, you can find similarities, like, oh, we both have the same favorite hamburger place or whatever, so sometimes it's more important to look at the scientific data than to just think that those stories individually prove how similar people are. So even though, for example, like with Paula and Elise, they both liked film, but there are other people you can randomly meet that you have the same major with, and it's not because you're genetically related to them, right? So film is a little more obscure, definitely, than psychology, but there's lots of other psychology teachers, so it's kind of a coincidence if you meet. It could be a coincidence that you meet people that you have similarities with. Also, this is something I started to talk about. Sometimes their environments aren't really that different. So the families who adopt have to go through a rigorous process, and they have to have enough money to be able to pay for, having a lawyer and going through all the process of adoption. So they probably aren't, it's not one of them is in poverty and one of them is rich, right? They probably are both have kind of middle income at least. They probably they are both married, 2 parents, that kind of thing, because it's easier to get a child if you have that. And in that case, there are both families that sought to adopt from a Jewish adoption agency. So that's an example of how sometimes it's not easy to, you're not getting a great example of how people who are raised completely differently would have been affected by that. So it's harder to see which similarities are because they're genetically similar and which are just because they were raised in kind of similar demographic or something. Okay, now besides twin studies, another type of study that tries to understand the influence of genetics versus environment are if you compare someone who's adopted to their biological relatives and to their adoptive relatives. So their adoptive relatives they have more of a shared environment with, and the biological relatives they have more shared genetics with. So they have to find people who they know who their biological relatives are. They're able to determine who they are in order to be in these studies. But these studies also find that the people who are adopted share more similar personalities on average to their biological relatives than to their adoptive relatives.
But that's what they know the biological parents.
Yeah, so it could have some confound like the twin studies. I don't know how many of them have actually met their biological relatives, but they are known. It's known who they are.
So they know who it is, but they don't know.
Well, some of them might have met them, and some might not have. Yeah. So personality is one of the main things that has a strong genetic influence, and that's found in all the different types of studies. And this is often surprising because when we compare ourselves to our own relatives, a lot of times it seems like there's a lot of variety there. And so it's kind of interesting. There are definitely still room for differences in personality, even if you share genetics. But there's a higher correlation with people you're genetically related to. And sometimes when you know, like people in your own family, or if you know a whole family that's biologically related, people tend to notice the differences more than the similarities. Especially if it's your own family. You'll kind of think of your family's general personality as being the norm, and then any differences that stick out is what you'll notice. There are some interesting stories about this as well. There's actually, the switched at birth kind of stories. Sometimes then they find out and they realize who their real biological parents were. There is a story, another radio story about this, where these two babies were in the same town, but they were switched, and one of the mothers realized it, but her husband wouldn't let her say anything, and so she waited until her husband died, and then she told everyone. And there's interviews with both of these females, and they both talk about how they were definitely different. They had a lot of differences in their interests and personality. Because one of the families was really more outgoing and social, and into sports and that kind of thing, and the other family was really studious and quiet and really into reading, and so both of the daughters had trouble kind of fitting in with their families, and so it ended up, I don't know, it seems like a lot of times it's really helpful for people to find out who their biological relatives are. That's kind of my own impression. Okay, there are also studies trying to figure out, okay, so we know that personality, some of these things are really influenced by genetics, but how does parenting matter then? Does it matter what your parents do? Does it really influence you? That's me with my parents. So it's been shown that parenting does have an influence on some of the attitudes related to politics and religious beliefs, for example. Also, kind of related to religion, just values or priorities in life, what you think is important, what you think is ethical. And then manners, what do you consider polite, what do you consider rude? That's influenced by your parents a lot. And also habits. So just how often do you clean, and what do you consider a full meal? Does it have to have, could you just have a sandwich, or do you always serve several things? That kind of thing. These habits of how you live, they're really influenced by your parents. So parents do have an influence, and some of the influence has to do also with them choosing other things in your environment. So they choose where you live. Sometimes they might not have as big of a choice as other times, but they might have a choice about, what, they might have some influence on who's your teacher in 3rd grade, or, how often you get to play with your friends and that kind of thing.
Well, and if you have strict parents, you're probably going to be habitually cleaning and be tidy and organized, unless your biology, makes you rebel. There's those kinds of situations that, those are habits, your beliefs in general, being told this is good and this is bad.
Right.
Little kids, they're going to believe that even on your biology.
Yeah, your beliefs are going to be influenced by them. Okay, so we've been talking about all these studies where they try to separate nature and nurture. So they try to separate out the effects that genetics have and the effects that the environment has. But the truth is that genetics can influence your environment, and the environment can influence your genetics, it turns out. So one of the ways that they can interact is biologically. And this is somewhat recent science, epigenetics, and it turns out that even if you look at someone's DNA, there's a lot of information you don't have, because So each gene is like a recipe for making a protein, right? But there are other things that influence whether that recipe is easy to see or access, or if it's hard to see or blocked. So these other molecules, like methyl groups attaching, or things that influence how tightly wound the double helix is, can determine how often a certain gene gets read. So sometimes people call it, the epigenetics can turn on and off genes. So we already knew that because we knew that that was how our different cells in our bodies were different, even though they have the same DNA in their nuclei. But it turns out that these differences in epigenetics are somewhat hereditary, and that these epigenetics can be influenced by the environment. So things can pull off methyl groups and add them on. And so what you eat, the toxins you're exposed to, whether you're malnourished or not, all of these things can change your epigenetics.
Is that kind of like if you work out and you start working out more and more, your body starts to become easier?
Well, getting exercise could affect your genetics. I'm not sure what you mean about the more you build the muscle.
Like right when if I were to just start, because I don't work out, if I were to start working out right now, it would probably, like, would it build this muscle slower than if I kept going at it? Like, would my body get better at building the muscle?
It's possible that it could influence you that way. So it could change your epigenetics if you exercise regularly. There are certain times when your epigenetics are easier to change in your life. When you're in the womb is one of the times it's easier to change them. So your mother's, or the person who bears you, their behaviors and exposures and things can influence your epigenetics. So that's why you may have been hearing news about studies where they talk about how it influences the baby if the mother is overweight at the time she's pregnant and things like that. So that's because it influences the fetus's epigenetics. It doesn't change their DNA code. It just changes how it's read, but it's semi-permanent. So it can be changed, but it's not like that. It doesn't get changed really easily. There are also studies where they've seen that if there's a famine in a location or something, that can influence the epigenetics of that town in future generations, because all the babies that were in the womb at the time of the famine, their epigenetics were changed by lack of certain nutrition. And then those epigenetics are passed on. Another time that people are susceptible to having their epigenetics changed is when they're an adolescent. So that's one of the reasons why sometimes the things that you do when you're an adolescent, they are more likely to affect you the rest of your life than things that you do when you're an adult. So some of the things that we know affect this are things like smoking and your diet. And then there's a lot more research being done to try and understand how these are affected and whether we can actually change them on purpose. But this is also partly why actually even identical twins, usually their epigenetics are pretty similar when they're born, although they'll be affected somewhat differently depending on their placement in the womb. But then the older they get, the more their epigenetics differ. So even though they have the same DNA, their DNA is not being read as similarly as they get older. So they have more differences, especially if one of them smokes and one of them doesn't or something. So are there any questions about the biology of epigenetics? Okay. So now we'll talk about another way that genes and environment can interact. Okay. Say that you were born with Mr. Bean's face. Do you think that people will treat you differently than if you've got this face? So your genetics have an effect on the way you look. And the way you look has an effect on your environment. So that's a way that genetics is influencing your environment. So do you see how that makes it harder to tell? There's a combination there, the genetics and the interaction with the environment. So that could have led to some of the differences between those two characters. So can you think of any other way that something that you get genetically might influence your environment? Skin color?
It relates to the liver cancer. There's people who resist cancer.
That's a good point. So skin color can affect the way other people treat you. Your health? Yeah. Whether you end up having to spend a lot of time in hospital or in bed, not as much time with friends. Was there another one? Personality? So how could your personality affect your environment? That's true. That's true. Also, for one of the easy examples, and if you compare people who are extroverted or social to people who are shy or introverted, which person is more likely to have a lot of experience in environments where there's lots of people? Someone who's extroverted will usually seek out environments that are different than the people who are introverted, right? And then some of the other things, like if you're genetically you have a certain talent, you might be more likely to seek out a career where you can use that talent. And therefore your environment, which is going to be determined by your career, is being affected by your genetics. So there are a whole bunch of examples where something that you get genetically can influence your environment. And sometimes people call this kind of your genetic niche. You seek out an environment where your genetics will prosper and where you'll be happiest. Okay, so we're almost out of time for today, but the next topic we're going to go over is introducing how culture influences people. And this is going to be something that we'll kind of refer to in all the different, maybe not all, but a lot of the sections of the book. It will say how culture influences memory or emotions or things like that. So this is something we'll kind of build the foundation and then we'll keep learning more about it.